What is compliance risk? Let's discuss the definition of compliance risk, and later we will also discuss about different types of laws and regulations that institutions are required to comply with. So first of all, compliance risk is also known as the regulatory risk. Compliance risk term and regulatory risk terms are used interchangeably by the institutions and organizations, especially the financial institutions. If you are working in the financial institutions in the compliance department or risk management department or even the internal audit function, then you must have heard these terms, the compliance risk and the regulatory risk. So what actually is compliance risk? Compliance risk is the category of the enterprise risk, which means the risk that the institution or organization may not accurately or may not appropriately understand, follow, and implement the applicable provisions of different laws, regulations, rules, standards, or notifications. Specialized institutions or the institutions like banks, money service businesses, payment gateways, crypto exchanges, cryptocurrency exchanges, and different kinds of brokerage houses, insurance companies. These types of organizations are regulated by the regulatory authorities or bodies, and such organizations are required to comply with different kinds of laws and regulations, rules and standards and notifications that are issued by the regulators from time to time. So, uh, the risk of non-compliance with such applicable laws, regulations, rules, and standards lead to the trigger of compliance risk. And if the institution or organization does not follow these rules, regulations, standards, and notifications, then based on the significance of non-compliance, the regulator might impose fines and penalties. So, compliance risk is the risk that the organization may not understand, follow, and implement the applicable provisions of the laws, regulations, rules, standards, or notifications. So there are different ways of implementation of applicable laws and regulations, either through the development of relevant policies and procedures like the anti-money laundering policy for compliance with anti-money laundering related laws and regulations, and data protection policies, and there might be different other policies like the information technology policy of the company, etc. So this was the compliance risk. Now let's move on to discuss the example of non-compliance risk or regulations. So we know that when we talk about let's say banks, so banks in the banks must have the compliance function within the organization, which is led by the chief compliance officer, and depending on the size of the bank, the compliance team is established, which is led by the chief compliance officer. So banks are required to follow different circulars, laws, and regulations that are issued by the central bank or the state bank. So we are not specifically discussing any specific country. So the central bank might be different in different countries. Like if we talk about the Asia or the specific countries in Asia, so the regulators might be named as the central bank or the state bank. So the purpose here is to understand that banks are required to follow the circulars, laws, regulations, and standards that are issued by the central bank of that particular country where the bank is actually registered and operating. And so if the bank does not follow or comply with the requirements laid down in those policies or the circulars, laws, or regulations that are issued by the central bank, then the compliance risk is triggered or created. And if the non-compliances are of significant nature, then the central bank imposes different penalties and fines on the bank. So you must have heard about, or you must have read in the newspapers that the banks are imposed with significant anti-money laundering or know your customer related fines and penalties, and those fines and penalties are imposed by the regulatory authorities because the bank's compliance function is weak, Banks customer due diligence processes are weak, or you can say the bank's transaction monitoring processes are weak, due to which non-compliances occur. And if the state bank or if the inspection team of the regulator finds significant non-compliance related instances or regulatory breaches, then fines and penalties are imposed on the banks. So AML and CDD and KYC are the few areas that are very crucial for the banking industry and the financial institutions, more specifically, to comply with, because these types of institutions deal with the public funds. uh, Customers deposit their money into the bank account, and then the bank must have to ensure that the customers are legitimate customers at the time of opening their bank accounts, and later the transactions of each customer must be regularly monitored by the compliance team to identify any suspicious behavior or any suspicious activity in the accounts of the customers. And if the suspicious transaction or activity is found, then appropriate investigation needs to be performed by the compliance team under the supervision of money laundering reporting officer or the chief compliance officer of the company. And the suspicious transactions, after performing appropriate investigations, must be reported to the regulatory authorities like the Financial Intelligence Unit or FIU of the relevant country. So we discussed the compliance risk. Compliance risk is the risk of non-compliance with applicable laws, regulations, rules, standards, and notifications. And we discussed the example of a bank where the bank is required to follow the rules and regulations, laws, etc. issued by the central bank. And if the bank does not comply with the requirements laid down in the applicable laws and regulations, then the regulator imposes fine because the compliance risk incident has occurred and the significance of the breach was not tolerable by the central bank, and therefore the management must have to pay the fine. And if the fine is imposed on the bank, then the bank loses the credibility, and you can say the reputational loss also occurs in that case. So if you are new to this channel, please subscribe this channel, because on this channel the GRC related videos are uploaded from time to time, and governance, risk management, and compliance areas are discussed, and more specifically the key conceptual topics are discussed to ensure that you get the practical insights of the topics. So please subscribe and share the video with your colleagues. Thank you.